Right, our next speaker, we have Callum Sinclair, who is the project manager for the Scottish Invasive Species Initiative, working for Scottish Natural Heritage. Callum has also worked for the Conservation Volunteers, Rivers and Fisheries Trust for Scotland, Scottish Environment Protection Agency, and also the Galloway Fisheries Trust. Apparently he enjoys the outdoors, getting wet in the pursuit of fish, and following the misfortunes of Heart of Midlothian FC, who I did look up, and I am sorry. He's going to chat to us now about the approach they've taken on managing invasives on a landscape scale, working with large partnerships and volunteer networks. So thank you very much.
Thank you. If anyone does follow football, you'll know that Hearts game was cancelled last night, which is the only way that means they've not got beaten last night. I'd also like to thank Nikki for putting me on at this time, because as well as following football, I also follow rugby, and around about this time Scotland will be getting turned over by Italy. So, she's at least managed to avoid another act of self-harm by actually going to watch football. So I've got 25 minutes or so, I think, to talk about mink control. So no squirrels will be mentioned in this talk from here on in. And it's a tale from Northern Britain, as I heard Scotland called on the radio a couple of weeks ago, which was interesting and maybe indicative of the times. Anyway, here we go. So the Scottish Invasive Species Initiative, a 4-year project, started 2017, due to end in 2021, and working with local level partners and volunteers to establish community-based strategic invasive management, which is not too dissimilar to some of the objectives of some of the individual schemes that you guys are involved in. And it's about engaging people with a local environment, and not just on a single species, but on multiple species, which I think is one of the tricks as we go forward. We're actually going to need to get our head round. Rather than just doing the same thing on the same thing on the same scale, I think we're going to need to challenge ourselves to think about how we smarten up our act collectively and make the most of the fantastic volunteer and community effort that we've been able to harness. And I'll come back to that. Our project area, a third of Scotland, 29,500 kilometres, and there's always someone from Wales in the audience, so I do feel the need to say that it's 1.5 times the size of Wales. That did rather backfire when I was sitting next to dinner last night, because Mariella was the Welsh person that I had thought of being in the audience, and it got worse from there. Because my brother, who's a partner in a vet practice in Pembrokeshire, is in the very same town as Mariella's mum, and has very intimate knowledge of Mariella's dog. In fact, may have been the final sight that Mariella's dog actually saw. So this slide is now dedicated to Dizzy the dog and Mariella's mum. But more seriously, I think what we're talking about the Invasive Species Initiative is control on a big scale, certainly in a UK context, a big scale, but a relatively small team. And I do think this is one of the other challenges we've got to think of as we seek to secure money in ever more difficult times with less money around. So for a big area, we have a very small gang involved in the project. Myself as a project manager, who very helpfully is based in Dumfries and Galloway, some 175 miles south of the project, a volunteer and communications officer, and 3 full-time and 2 seasonal project officers, and a part-time admin level support to cover that patch. But more importantly still is that we are also engaging directly with a range of partners to deliver work on that sort of scale. So rather than employing more staff and more project staff that then run away as contracts come to the end, we're actually investing in the partners themselves so that their staff, we're paying for some of their time on the basis that those staff are likely to be around for the long term, those organisations are there for the long term, and they should be connected or better connected with individual communities and volunteers within which they work. So it is a multi-partnership project funded by National Lottery Heritage Fund, which is a go-to funder, I guess, for many of us, SNH, and in-kind support from those number of partners there to the tune of 1.25 million. So quite a substantial partnership, SNH leading the scheme. Most of those are individual fishery-based organisations covering multiple rivers or catchments in Scotland. but very importantly with an academic partner in the University of Aberdeen. And we'll see how important that has been in mink control in Scotland, and how the input of that academic partner has been critical to what we're doing now and how we smarten our act up as we go forward. SISI project isn't just mink. I'm going to predominantly talk about mink, but I will come back at the end a little bit to plant control, because it does come back to the point about the same people and the same communities and the same volunteers being engaged with multiple species, not just mink. And rather inevitably, we've got education and awareness programs as well, which again, I'm not going to talk about here other than to say that we do all the things that you all do. Facebook, Twitter, all that sort of stuff, and try and be innovative and try and use that to reach people to be engaged with us. But I'm not going to talk about that. Haven't just talked about it. But the real core theme of this isn't actually the project officers or the areas or the partners. It's really all the people. I don't even like volunteers. I think it's a people thing at this. As any environmental project is, it's about winning hearts and minds. It's about taking people with you and helping them engage with what you're doing and finding common purpose. So this project has been about engagement, not just with the local delivery partners, but with the people that are round about those. And we actually have a bigger budget to support volunteers than we have for employment of contractors to control invasive plants. So I've had to place orders for 200 sets of waders, 500 sets of spray suits, and many multiple times for all sorts of wellies and other kit and caboodle. Because you've got to invest in those volunteers and support them and make that genuinely something that they are not taken for granted on, which I think sometimes is a risk with volunteer-based schemes. So, American mink, voracious predators, very effective predators, and we heard earlier on about the naivety of prey and so how that can actually make them even more effective than they would be in the natural environment. But they know what they're doing as a predator, and they're certainly very effective at removing, particularly water voles, ground nesting birds, but they will take all sorts of things. We get regular contacts from hen keepers who've lost whole clutches of hens and others, so they will take whatever's there. They're widespread, all over the shop, I think it's a technical term, but they're at low density. So some of the numbers of squirrel kills, which I saw up earlier on in terms of the thousands, we are 10% of that sort of figure. So they are widespread and at low density, and they're seasonally mobile. So about now, as spring is about to spring, they have things on their mind. They have love on their mind. So they are now moving around trying to find places where they can reproduce and make territories. And in the autumn time, they have the same sort of thing post-breeding, and as the young mature, they seek to disperse too. So we have real two key periods in the year where these things are on the move. And when they're on the move, that's the most obvious opportunity where we can catch them and remove them. Why are we bothering about mink? Well, there's a number of reasons given earlier on about the various reasons for invasive species being in existence. These are two maps from Scotland, mink in 1967, a number of sort of nodal populations related to principally mink fur farms, and either escapes from those or deliberate releases by animal rights campaigners. So we had a number of those isolated populations, but by the time you get to 2010, mink have spread significantly, taken over the vast majority of Scotland, other than the very north and the very mountainous areas in the northwest. So they were all over the place, causing damage to lots of different species and animals and impacting on native biodiversity. They're also very resilient animals. So I think in terms of dispersal, and the figure, the mink on your left, is based on genetic analysis. So I was fascinated by the genetic analysis on squirrels. So these show that the interrelationships between mink that we have captured and removed. So basically, female mink and the interrelationships with the offspring of those mink being captured across a very wide area. Because mink spread and emigrate, so once they're born in their patch, they lie for a while, but when they move at each seasonal dispersal period, 90% of them move. Most of them move average rate about 20 kilometres distance, but 20% will move 80 kilometres. So they move a lot, which is a different story from the squirrel project, where introduction and generally static. which has different challenges then for trapping. For example, in this sort of instance, there is no point in trapping or removing on a small or local scale, because all you will do is leave the area open for recolonisation. So you've got to go large, and you've got to think about it on an island basis, as Eileen mentioned earlier on, and we'll come to that again in a second. And they also respond to management. So when young mink find themselves in a place where there ain't very many other young mink, they become ever more successful at reproducing, so they compensate. So as you depress the numbers, those that remain reproduce more effectively. So we've got an ongoing challenge that mink move around a lot and are very good at it. And actually when you depress the numbers, they reproduce ever more effectively, so you've got to continue to maintain the control. So can you deliver control on that sort of scale? Well, we believe that you can, because we are. And this is a map which is derived from a prior project, Scottish Mink Initiative, which Anne-Marie, somewhere, was part of generating some of those dots on the map. So that partnership had over 1,000 volunteers removing mink from a massive area, and really at high density trapping effort and high density monitoring effort to make that depression in population initially. And what that does is allows us to be a learning based project where you look at the evidence, you look at what you're finding from your work, and you tactically change plan if need be. So knowing the abundance of mink and when trapping is happening or monitoring is trapping allows you to identify when you're likely to make a difference. So this graph here is showing the decline curve of mink abundance in 3 of the catchments within that previous project. And what that does is help you identify the period that you need to be active to make a difference. So in these examples, we managed to halve the abundance of mink in those catchments within 4 years. And when you extrapolate those curves, you can see that by 10 years at that sort of level of effort, in the right place with the right approach, you can reduce those mink numbers to, if not 0, then certainly almost 0, and to a level that the biodiversity and other animals will respond and recover in the absence of mink. So it's not just about continuing to do the same thing, it's about using the data that you're gathering and knowing that you're gathering data for a purpose, and then making management change to your practice. And here's some of the rates that may show this a little bit. These are as I go from left to right, one is the mink detection rate that we found across the period of the project, where you can see that the mink detection rate in the middle of that figure began to drop as more mink were removed. And you look at the figure in the middle, where you can see the darker red showing the frequency that mink were being detected in that network of rafts. And you can see where the hotspots are, that northeast corner, some of these coastal areas, some of these river catchments. And then as you go to the final year, from July 14 to July 15, that's remaining that's in the remaining areas where we were detecting mink from the monitoring. So the middle one is showing everywhere that we found some mink based on the monitoring that we were doing. And the third one is actually what mink we were detected in the final year. So much less widespread, much less intense figures of mink, and therefore an impact on the control. So that allows us to think a little bit now, as we are in the Scottish Invasive Species Initiative, as to tactics and how we deploy resources and where we deploy resources. And the map on the right basically is showing the sort of levels of intensity of effort that we're deploying now to the project. So the reds are where we're still getting too many mink, pretty much, and therefore we've got to be quite intense in our monitoring and trapping effort. But the oranges and greens are where we have made reductions in mink numbers, and we know this habitats of where they are, and we can target our effort, and therefore we can target the time of our project officers, and we can seek to target the effort of the volunteers. So it's not just about continuing to do the same thing, it's about learning from where you're catching and learning about the ecology and the relationship between genetics and the ecology of the mink, and responding to that sort of evidence. And also knowing a little bit about the ecology of the animal itself. Mink like certain habitats and don't like other certain habitats. So the mountainous areas and the bogs and wetlands are not where you're going to find huge densities of mink. But actually, coastal areas and farmland are. So therefore, we've kind of got some clues already as to where mink are likely to be. And when you look at even a very broad brush scale of the sort of that map of Scotland, which is a relief map essentially, you can see that the coastal areas in green correspond quite closely to where we were finding the majority of our mink records. So that's all well and good. So that was what we'd done previously. And this map is now showing the mink raft coverage as we are operating right now. So we're down at 600 or so, 641 I think from memory, individual monitoring locations where we're seeking to remove mink, either through monitoring and responding by traps, or actually just being there and overseeing it. And this map maybe begins to bring in the sort of island concept that Ailey mentioned earlier on. Obviously, the North Sea is a big swim to Scandinavia, and essentially that northeastern corner is functioning as an island. The mountains of the Grampian region, the sort of brown area in the middle there, the mountainous part, is acting as a barrier to mink movement, because mink generally will not try to move over those sort of mountainous patches. And we have wetlands and things, and we have the coast rather on the west coast there at the Minch between Outer Hebrides. And we have, if you remember the distribution map right at the beginning, the north corner, the northern part of Scotland doesn't have mink. So in almost all of these areas, we have an opportunity to treat this patch as an island. But the area that we have constantly got to defend is the southernmost patch, which is Tayside and thereabouts, so Dundee, Perth. There is a very bad joke about that, but I'm not going to say it in this company. So what we're really having to do then is protect mink migration into the area. And the majority of that migration is going to come from the south. And at the minute, more than half the mink we've captured in the first 2 years of this scheme have been in Tayside and Esk, because that's where mink are able to move, that's where their preferred habitats are, and the rest of those sites are really almost care and maintenance, if you like, as to where we are. And when we look at capture locations again, a similar sort of sequence of maps, you can see particularly the middle map perhaps is the whole distribution of mink capture locations over 2006 to 15. So very widespread set of capture sites. But if you go to the far right map, that was the mink captured in the final year of the project. So much reduced distribution of capture sites, because we've actually depressed the density and pressed the numbers there, and therefore there's less there, and we're protecting migration from the south. So that was the 26 to 15 project, and when the next map is going to show you the mink capture locations from the current scheme of the last 2 years, and you'll find that they rather eloquently and thankfully mirror the preferred locations as to what we've found before. So there we go. Tayside, Dundee, Perth, thereabouts, flurry of capture sites in the south, and then we have an ongoing cluster but an ongoing set of records within the northeast of Scotland where we have good habitats for mink reproduction and significant numbers being captured from coastal sites. So we can see that understanding the movements, understanding the ecology, understanding the geography of the country allows us to target our effort into the right places and not be wasting our time in places where mink are not going to be. So, challenges. Not surprisingly money, but I do think this is a challenge for us to think about in a slightly different way. This is just a profile of project investment in the mink projects in their various guises over the last 10 years or so. And you can see where things stop and start, and where we have gaps in between. And before the Mink Initiative come along, or the Invasive Species Initiative come along, we had a 2-year hiatus where everyone was scrambling around trying to find money before it was found. And that actually makes a big impact to the cost. You've got to re-energise, you've got to reconnect with volunteers, and you've got to make it all happen from a standing start again. It's absolute waste of time, stupidity, frankly. And you have a changeover in staff, you have projects with different names, you have damage to the relationship of trust with the volunteers. They don't care what your logo is, thankfully. They just are committed to the project, whatever it might be, and they just want to carry on with the project, whatever it might be, and they don't frankly care who the lead organisation is, what your badge is and how much money you've got. They just have committed their expertise and resource, and they want to continue to do so. So, what can we learn from practical conservation in this scheme? You can control mink on a large scale. When we were putting these bids together, we did actually try and secure letters of support from a number of organisations. And one of the groups, the group that actually invented the Mink raft, which is a key monitoring tool, Game Wildlife Conservation Trust, declined to give us a letter of support because they didn't think mink control could happen on that sort of scale. Well, they gave us a letter that was so dreadful I refused to submit it. It's probably closer to the option. The high dispersal potential of the animal means that you've got to go on a large scale. If you don't, then all you're doing is wasting your time because they will simply reinvade. You need to understand the ecology of the animals. So settled females are really important because they breed and they continue to breed and they're in prime locations to breed effectively. So finding where those are and removing them is key. And also removing mink as they move is important because they're inhabiting new places to reproduce. And actually working with volunteers can deliver on a large scale, but some projects, I'm sure none of them here, don't make the efforts they should to retain volunteers or reach volunteers or value them, or even worse, consider volunteers as cheap labour. They're not. Volunteers are there for lots of reasons and lots of justifications, and can engage with science and can engage with practical management and want to. But people come and go in these schemes, and you've got to be on it all the time to bring in new people as other people find jobs, have harsh winter and are lost to us, or just are unable to continue with the scheme. And people have got a range of motivations, and you've got to understand what those motivations are, because if people are motivated to involve themselves with your scheme, if they want to continue, you've got to continue to motivate them. And you have actually got some points in time where, as people, more and more people know about what you're doing, sometimes the motivation clashes with the logic of the management. So we have people who want to volunteer and take a mink raft on the top of the Cairngorms. And lovely that would be for a dot on the map, it's not going to find a mink. So, what can you do? Well, short-term funds is a big problem. You've got to plan ahead almost before, as you start for the next scheme. You can control mink. It is socially acceptable. We have been subject to press articles where PETA have been invited to make a contribution, and everyone got their knickers in a twist about that. All that happened was we had another 20 volunteers get in touch with us wanting to be involved. So I think that, unlike the grey squirrel, the mink has rather less friends at court, and therefore I think we can progressively be at it and on it all the time. And without fear or favour, I don't think we should be shying away from this. This is conservation, this is management when it's practical, and it involves removal of an animal. And if you do that in a robust and logical way and humanely, then I think that's good with me. But you have got to get buy-in from the big players. There are a number of organisations, whether it's Forest and Land Scotland, whether it's SNH perhaps on reserves, RSPB, Scottish Wildlife Trust, these are all landholders. And as you engage individual volunteers or estates, they are going to play your game only if they know that all those other big players are lined up. And I think that has brought some challenges as we've tried to actually persuade organisations like RSPB to get involved in this in the same way that other land organisations have. And that's not always been successful, but it has actually allowed us to have a debate and a discussion with those sort of organisations, say, this is a project, it's a serious piece of work, and we want you involved, and you should be involved. So in terms of the mink control over the last 2 years, well, you can read the numbers, can't you? Why am I bothering? We're covering lots of catchments by mink rafts and mink traps. Picture on the left is a mink raft. What happens is this is a floating structure on any body of water or a ditch or a burn, and the mink are nosy little buggers, and what they do, they will jump onto that raft and go through the tunnel, under the wooden tunnel. And underneath that wooden tunnel is a little clay pad, so when they go under it, they leave their footprints. And therefore we can identify the footprints, and as we know therefore that mink are in town, we can then switch from monitoring, which is the raft, to trapping, which is clearly to remove them. And the reason we do that is that, as you'll know, if you run a capture trap, you've got to have it checked every day. We can run the monitoring program where it can be checked every week or every fortnight, and we respond to the actual presence of mink there. Yeah. But what we find is that we're knocking over mink still. We have a volunteer network which is increasing, and we have 31,000 volunteer hours over the first 2 years of the scheme on mink control alone. And bearing in mind that most of that is monitoring, and we're counting 15 minutes a week per volunteer, you can understand that it's a cumulative and collective effort that generates those sort of things. But I did mention at the beginning, this is more than mink. Because if you're astute, you'll have figured out there's lots of mink rafts and not a lot of places with mink. So you may be looking after a mink raft and never see a footprint, far less find a mink. So if you're a volunteer and you're doing a project which is catching nothing, seeing nothing, I suspect you're likely to pack up and go on to something else. So one of the things that we're encouraging people is to do the connection with invasive species more widely, beyond just a single species project and controlling plants. So this is the prioritised locations of our plant control scheme, where we have a limited budget for contractors, but widespread action by communities and volunteers. And we are building capacity and skills by putting hundreds of people through qualifications to allow them to spray chemicals on these plants, to be first aid qualified if they want to run groups, and to buy the kit and caboodle that they need to be maintaining that programme after SISI's gone. And again, here's some numbers here, 12,300 and odd volunteer hours on plant control alongside the numbers on mink control. And some of those are the same people. The other stats are just numbers really, they're not that important really. But when you bring it all together, this is about people. The project has got to be smart, it's got to learn, it's got to be tactically astute, it's got to deploy its resources in the right places at the right time. But if you're running a volunteer project, or a project on which is reliant on volunteers, it's a people project. And when we see that that little head count of staff at the beginning, which is basically half a dozen, is augmented by over 30 FTE volunteer years in the first 2 years, that's where the focus should be. Not on the project officers, there's half a dozen of them. It's on these 30 FTEs, which are equating to almost 800 volunteers in 2019. So that's where we are at. That's how we're approaching it. But I would say, I think that observations at this point in time is that as we find funding more difficult to come by, I think the challenge for all of us in these sort of projects is to think a little bit differently about how we fund and what we fund. I think the volunteer should be at the centre of this and not the project. I don't think developing individual projects that have dead websites, dead apps, dead databases is a smart way to go when we're actually working with the same people in many locations. I would love to see us stop the bus on a lot of these schemes and say, we need a volunteer hub. And you register as a volunteer and all the projects come to the volunteer hub. And you can sign up for whatever project you want to be involved in. Whereas at the minute, you've got to sign up for SISI, you've got to sign up for squirrels, you've got to sign up for this, you've got to sign up for that, you've got to sign up for the other. And actually, what a waste of time that is. Wouldn't it be nice if the people that we're relying upon were the centre of what we're building? We weren't building lots of new apps. I don't want apps on my phone. I don't want one app. I certainly don't want half a dozen. It would be nice to have a simplification of that and a consolidation of it so that the people that are delivering the schemes, which are the volunteers, were absolutely at the centre of it. That's me done. Thank you.